So here we go.
So there are two types of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And we're going to use this chart right here to compare the similarities and differences between the two. So the first characteristic is which kingdoms of life include these organisms. Do you want to tell us?
Sure. So our prokaryotes, we know that they're only bacterial species, and so there are only two kingdoms of life that contain bacteria. So it's going to be archaebacteria and eubacteria.
But if you can just remember bacteria, you should be good to go.
You should be good to go. And for our eukaryotes, it's everything else.
Right.
Everything else that has a nucleus, because that's the important thing that differentiates these two types of cells. All right, let's look at size. Prokaryotes?
Prokaryotes are bacteria, so they're very small.
Yep.
Whereas eukaryote cells tend to be larger.
Okay, so the easy thing is that if you know one side of this table, the other side of the table is just the opposite.
Right.
That's the nice thing about it. All right, let's talk about prokaryotes. Are they simple or complex?
They are simple. There's not a whole lot going on.
And then that means our eukaryotes are going to be?
Complex.
All right. And then whether or not they have a nucleus, we told you to remember no. So prokaryotes have no nucleus. And that means the eukaryotes, which is us, or you are a eukaryote, so it's going to have all the same characteristics that your cells have, and we know that your cells have a brain. Membrane-bound organelles.
So this goes right along with nucleus. You want to remember no. So all those fancy organelles like mitochondria, chloroplasts that have membranes around them, they are not going to be in a prokaryote, but they are going to be in a eukaryote.
Yeah, those guys are just too complex for prokaryotic cells. All right, let's go down and look at the second table. There are two main types of eukaryotic cells, so let's talk about what those two types are.
So the two types they're going to ask you about the most on the SOL are plant and animal cells. So once again, let's use this table to compare and contrast them. So starting off with nucleus. So these are both eukaryotes, so they are both going to have a nucleus.
Very nice. And mitochondria, well, we know that mitochondria gives our cells energy, and mitochondria has a membrane that surrounds it. So anything that contains membrane-bound organelles will have this particular organelle in general. So we know that plants and animals are both eukaryotic, so they're both going to have this particular organelle. Cell walls. Cell walls help to give the shapes that contain them the cells that contain them very specific shapes. So what shape is a plant cell?
So a plant cell is pretty square, pretty rigid, and that's because, yes, it does have a cell wall. But animal cells, like your cells, do not have a cell wall, and so they tend to be more round.
Yeah, they tend to be more blob-like because there's nothing that's maintaining their shape.
Right.
Now, chloroplasts. Chloroplasts have a very specific job, Ms. Hines. Can you tell us what their specific job is?
Their specific job is to make food using the sun's energy, a process we've learned about this year called photosynthesis.
Now, we know that that's a defining process in plants. So plants have to contain chloroplasts. It also helps to explain why they're so green. And animal cells, us, we are obviously heterotrophs, so we cannot make our own food. Unfortunately, we don't do photosynthesis. A large central vacuole, that's sort of like the water tower of the cell. So what has this large space inside of it?
It's going to be something that needs that water for photosynthesis.
Yeah, so it's only going to be plants in this case. So animals do not have a large central vacuole. We do have a vacuole, but our vacuoles tend to be very small in size.
Right. Okay, so now we're going to run through this list of the most important organelles and what they do. So starting with the nucleus. The nucleus is the control center of the cell, and that's because it has what molecule inside of it?
It has DNA. That's super important.
So let's write control center of the cell.
And it contains our DNA. And it's just something to remember from our last SOL review. DNA is always stuck in the nucleus. Why, Ms. Hines?
Because it's a really fat molecule. It's double-stranded.
All right, let's look at ribosomes. Ribosomes are kind of unique in that they're found in all cells, whether prokaryotic or eukaryotic, because they don't have a membrane. But they have one very specific job.
And that is to make proteins.
So they are the site of protein synthesis, which we also talked about in our last review.
Right.
All right, mitochondria, mighty mitochondria. What does the mighty mitochondria do for us?
The mighty mitochondria makes energy, and in the cell, that energy is in the form of one very specific molecule.
3 letters, ATP.
ATP, energy.
And so, question, what process makes this ATP in the mitochondria?
Good question. That process is called aerobic cellular respiration.
So if we were to ask you, for instance, where does cellular respiration take place in a cell, you should be able to tell us mitochondria. Where does photosynthesis take place? You should be able to tell us
the chloroplast,
which is our
brings
next
us
organelle.
to the next line. Yeah, so we can write down that the chloroplast is where photosynthesis happens, and we can write that the chloroplast makes food for the cell.
And just so you guys know, for sure, to be specific, the food that we're talking about is something called C6H12O6, or glucose.
Right.
All right, the cell membrane. All cells have a cell membrane. And what's the cell membrane's job?
The cell membrane is the door. It controls what enters and exits the cell.
So another way of thinking about it, we can say that the cell membrane basically maintains homeostasis.
Right.
So it maintains balance for the cell. And keep in mind, guys, the cell membrane is one of those crazy terms. It has 3 other terms that mean the same exact thing.
Yeah,
so if we
let's jot some
say
of those down.
the cell membrane, we're also talking about the plasma membrane. We're also talking about the fluid mosaic model, which is
Right.
a really crazy term. And it's a long one, so we'll see if we can squeeze it in. And then there's one more based on 2 rows of a very specific molecule.
Which we're going to draw a picture of in a sec, and that's called a phospholipid bilayer, and we'll talk more about that.
And just remember, everything that we're writing on the screen, whether it's on a line or not, you need to make sure that you include it in your notes as well. It'll help you for the SOL. All right, let's look at the next one, cytoplasm.
So the cytoplasm is like the stuffing. It's just the fluid filling of the cell. It's mostly water.
Okay, and that's really all you need to know
Yeah.
about that guy. The next one is the lysosome, and we've been talking about lysosomes all year. So what is a lysosome's job in a cell?
So a lysosome's job is to break down and sometimes recycle molecules that aren't needed anymore by the cell.
So it's kind of like the garbage can or the recycling center.
Yeah.
So it's pretty easy to remember. So again, garbage can or recycling center, that's the job of the lysosome. And then our last major organelle, and obviously this is not an all-inclusive list, but these are the most important guys that we want you to know for the SOL, is a vacuole. And we talked about a large central vacuole before, but we haven't talked about just in general what vacuoles do.
So vacuoles are kind of like closets. They're there for storage for the cell. They're used for storage. So in this next part, we're going to take a look at 3 different types of cells and just point out a few structures that you might be asked to identify. So first off, let's talk about what each of these cells is.
All right, if we look at this very first one in the upper left-hand corner, we see that this is bacteria. We know that it's bacteria because it has some funny-looking structures hanging off the back end. So we know it's bacteria, number 1, because it has this weird coating on it. And this weird coating has these things sticking off of it that sort of look like little tiny hairs.
Yeah.
And so we're going to call those cilia. And cilia can be used to help with attachment. They can also be used for movement. But really the main structure that's used for movement on this guy are these long whip-like structures that are coming off of the bottom end, and these guys are called flagella. And really the only cells in our body that have flagella, and it wouldn't be us, it would be the male version of our species, would be sperm.
Right. So just a couple other things to point out. Notice some of the organelles that this bacteria, this prokaryote does have. It does have a cell membrane.
Because all cells do.
Right. It does have ribosomes, those little dots to make proteins.
Because all cells do.
But then when we look at the center of this cell, we do not see a nucleus. Instead, we see a whole bunch of loose DNA in the center.
And remember, there's no nucleus. That should make sense to you, right, Miss Hines? Because it's a prokaryote, and we should remember no. All right, let's jump over to the other side. We have a very structure that should be not unfamiliar to you because it makes up who we are.
Right. This is an animal cell. And a couple of ways I know it's an animal cell, when I look in the middle, I see this one structure that really stands out. It's got DNA inside of it. This is the nucleus.
Also the control center.
So I know that this is a eukaryote because you do have a nucleus. I noticed that it's round. It does not have a cell wall. Instead, on the outside, there's just a cell membrane. I see some dots. Those are my ribosomes. One organelle I see that I did not see in my prokaryote are these guys right here. They look like ovals with little swirls inside.
And they're mighty.
Right. Those are my mitochondria.
And, you know, we often compare those things to, we say they look like kidney beans, or they're a bean-like structure to help you remember what it is. Is there anything else that we want to point out on that guy?
I don't think on here. Let's jump down to our plant cell.
Okay.
So how do we know this is a plant cell, Miss Cook?
Well, we know this is a plant cell because it has three things that animal cells never have.
Okay.
The first thing that we see, which is kind of large on the inside, it has a large central vacuole, so that's our water storage, because plants need a lot of water to do photosynthesis. And speaking of photosynthesis, they need another unique organelle that we don't have, which helps to give the plant its color, and it's the site of photosynthesis, and it's called the
chloroplast.
So we have chloroplasts here. Notice that these are not like mitochondria, because every year people mix them up. Chloroplasts have these little stacks of pancakes, or we can say they look like stacks of cookies or hockey pucks that are found inside of them. And then another major difference would be the shape. So you'll notice that we have two barriers that are defining this particular structure. The inner barrier is the cell membrane, which is not unique because all cells have it. But the outer barrier is unique in that it's only found in plant cells, not found in animal cells, and that's our
cell wall.
And everything else is going to be about the same. So we have a nucleus because it's a eukaryotic organism. We still have mitochondria. That's important to know. Plants have both because they still need to be able to make ATP. And then we also have like the Golgi and the endoplasmic reticulum, both the smooth and the rough. But those